it's gonna walk. Oh yeah, it is. So yeah,
Okay, I tell her to not.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Appreciate it.
Very good. Cool. Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. Is everything starting? Perfect. Thank you, Lab. Yep. Hello everyone. Welcome to Capitalism. What is it and why should we be against it? A panel discussion hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. My name is Arthur and I will be moderating the panel discussion. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 1930s, new 1960s to 1970s, and post-political 1980s to 1990s, left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. Our members at Arizona State University host a weekly reading group, as well as weekly coffee break discussions on contemporary topics related to the left. Obviously, this semester is over, but we will be hosting a summer reading group soon, as well as preparing our schedule for the coming fall semester. If you are interested or have any questions, please feel free to ask one of us after the panel or reach out to us on Instagram. Each of our panelists have been asked to prepare an opening statement of up to 12 minutes each. They will then have 5 minutes to respond to one another. The rest of our time will be devoted to audience Q&A, with the panel running for about 2 hours. We hope to finish probably like 7:30 at the latest. For those in the audience, as well as our panelists who wish to continue the conversation with us, please join us after the panel at Casey Moore's Oyster Bar. I will now introduce our three panelists in speaking order. First up is Henry Stevens, a computer science major at ASU and founder of Students and Faculty for Democratizing ASU, or SFDASU. Inspired in part by the Berkeley free speech movement and other traditions of student radicalism, Henry has focused much of his organizing around civil liberties on campus, opposition to surveillance infrastructure like ASU's flock camera system, and solidarity with campus workers, organizing with the Unite Here Campus Workers Union. Politically, Henry draws from a wide range of Marxist traditions and is especially committed to overcoming sectarian divisions on the campus left in favor of practical local organizing and collective student worker action. Our second panelist, Paul Saba, is a lifelong communist, retired lawyer, historian of the left, and longtime political activist. Paul comes from a multi-generational communist family, deeply connected to the history of the Communist Party USA and the international communist movement. In the 1970s, he was active in the new communist movement and was one of the founders of the Tucson Marxist-Leninist Collective. Today, he is a major contributor to the Marxist Internet Archive and administrator of the Encyclopedia of Anti-Revisionism Online, where he helps preserve and make accessible an enormous body of socialist history and literature. Few people possess Paul's depth of historical knowledge or firsthand experience with the left across generations, so we're very excited to have him here tonight. Finally, Bobby Nichols of the Phoenix Metro Democratic Socialists of America. Bobby is currently running for Tempe City Council on an affordability-focused platform centered on housing, tenant protections, and public accountability. Since joining DSA in 2019, he has worked in electoral organizing at both the local and national level, including as a legislative fellow for San Francisco Supervisor Dean Preston, and later as co-chair of DSA's National Electoral Commission. Bobby describes himself as, quote, a socialist first, an organizer second, and a politician third, end quote, and sees electoral politics not as an end in itself, but as one arena of struggle within a broader movement for socialism. The prompt for the panel is as follows. One of the peculiar features of the present moment is that capitalism appears at once triumphant and deeply unstable. More than 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the apparent victory of liberal capitalism, we find ourselves in a world increasingly defined by economic stagnation, political polarization, ecological crisis, declining faith in institutions, and the return of forms of politics once thought buried by history. At the same time, despite periodic upsurges of protest and renewed interest in socialism, the left remains fragmented and uncertain of its own horizons. For Marxists, this raises a deeper historical problem. Marx understood capitalism not simply as an unjust system, but as a historically dynamic and contradictory form of social life, one that simultaneously revolutionizes the world while reproducing domination, crisis, and alienation. Yet Marxism itself emerged out of the struggle to make sense of capitalism's changing historical character. The debates between reform and revolution, party and spontaneity, nationalism and internationalism, labor and capital, democracy and dictatorship were never merely theoretical disputes. They reflected attempts by the left to understand the possibilities for political action within capitalism at different moments of historical development. Today, many of the categories that once oriented the left appear increasingly unstable. Is neoliberalism ending or merely transforming itself? Does class struggle still organize political life in the way Marxists once imagined? Has capitalism entered a new phase of global restructuring? And if so, what forms of political organization correspond to it? Why does socialism appear simultaneously more imaginable and more distant than it has in decades? And perhaps most importantly, what would it mean for the left not merely to resist capitalism morally, but to understand historically the conditions under which capitalism might actually be overcome? Tonight's panel is an attempt to open these questions rather than resolve them prematurely. We've brought together organizers, activists, and intellectuals coming from different generations and different political experiences to reflect on capitalism, its contradictions, its historical transformations, and the changing possibility for emancipatory politics today. With that said, we'll start with Henry.
Hi. What is capitalism and why should we be against it? So I'd like to start just by describing how we should view capitalism. We should not think of it as an ideology alongside Marxism, because unlike communism, capitalism was not designed consciously as a system. In 1848, Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto, but there was no Capitalist Manifesto. Yes, businessmen strategized to plan their firms in order to maximize profit, and the revolutionaries of the late 18th century built organizations such as the Jacobin clubs, but capitalism began before this, developing gradually within feudalism as an impersonal form of domination. We can roughly periodize stages of capitalism, which is important but incomplete. Lenin called imperialism the highest stage of capitalism. According to Lenin, capital became so centralized that it fused with banks and the state apparatus. Rather than firms competing freely within a country, imperialism constituted geopolitical competition between nation-states. Expansionist empires had already existed prior to the 1870s, but imperialism took on a qualitatively new character when the Western empires collided. And this also took on a political character since it split the socialist movement, causing Lenin to form the Communist International. If imperialism originated after the development of industrial capitalism, then how did industrial capitalism develop? It took both gradual change as well as rapid political revolution to spread the Industrial Revolution. France took several revolutions to consolidate bourgeois power, and it took America a civil war to reunify the country and abolish chattel slavery. Both of these were prerequisites, so it wasn't just this gradual progress due to the free market. However, capitalism has generated new problems and crises. Every decade or so, it goes into a recession or a crisis. And this is what people mean when they talk about the instability or contradictions of capitalism. But it always seems to restabilize. Recessions, because they create poverty, they can intensify class struggle. And theoretically, the proletariat should revolt during the recessions. But if they don't, it can restabilize. And I could keep going on about abstract Marxist theories about this, and there are also many non-Marxist theorists. But for the purpose of this panel, I won't retread old terrain. Instead, I'll get concrete and relate this to my own work within Svedasa. Students and Faculty for Democratizing ASU is a political organization formed to defend civil liberties after ICE's detention of Mahmoud Khalil, and eventually to socialize the university under joint student-faculty control. ASU, while not a global system or even a nation state, is a massive public university which arguably has more power than our city government. Spadassu attempts to develop a praxis based upon the critique of Michael Crow's New American University and open dialogue with other student activists. I argue that simple periodizations of capitalism are insufficient to address recent changes within it, and previous Marxist strategies must, at the very least, be updated. The New Left, in its underappreciated initial phase, developed a deep analysis of the Cold War university and class relations, even though nowadays most Marxists dismiss it either as petty bourgeois student radicalism or third worldism. But in doing so, we forget the early stages, such as the Berkeley free speech movement and the early Students for a Democratic Society. I think one thing which sort of expresses how we should understand class is a debate within SDS between the Progressive Labor Party and the Praxis Axis. The Progressive Labor Party was an anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist group, and the Praxis Axis, it was Marxist, but it was actually more oriented towards syndicalism. So the founder of the Praxis Axis, Carl Davidson, he wrote a book, Student Syndicalism, which describes how we can apply these old methods to the knowledge factory. And I'm going to be quoting two articles, one from the PLP and then one from Student Syndicalism. PLP argued for unity with workers in industry, transportation, and communications, and to concretize this unity by supporting strikes in auto and other heavy industries. SDS's right wing, as we called it, opposed this position, arguing that the traditional working class had become obsolete, it was hopelessly reactionary, and the real hope lay in the new working class of alienated intellectuals and professionals. So they portray it as right-wing and petty bourgeois because it focuses on students, but really Davidson was trying to show how students, when they graduate, they become skilled workers, and they are still members of the working class. And he actually argues that some university workers at the high level, such as administrators, might side with the capitalists. So he says, the largest group of faculty, the lower echelon, were primarily engaged in teaching the mass production line. Large classes should be seen as members of the new working class. So the reason he focused on students is because SDS was a student organization. But he recognized the problems of the university as problems of capitalism, and he used the metaphor of the knowledge factory. Like any good training program, the knowledge factory accurately reproduces the conditions and relations of advanced corporate capitalism: isolation, manipulation, and alienation. Although Marxist capital and many other theories provide ample descriptions of capitalism, it's also necessary to get more concrete, and to do that, we need to use the method of workers' inquiry. This is essential for creating an effective praxis for change in our current conditions. The tradition of workers' inquiry goes back to Marx, but it was really popularized by the Italian workerists in the 60s. And a few publishers like Viewpoint Magazine and Notes from Below publish articles related to this. Notes from Below argues for the importance of understanding what they call class composition, which we can only know through workers' inquiry and co-research. Essentially, workers talking to each other about their jobs, not just complaining, but also identifying how can we shut down production, how can we restructure production, things like that. Notes from Below defines class composition as how classes in society are formed and operate. They divide it into three categories: technical, social, and political. Technical is how workers are technically arranged within any work, how our time is managed, and what we must produce and in what conditions. and what managerial or technical mechanisms mediate work. Social composition essentially describes the conditions outside of the workplace, such as do they have to support a family, do they own their own house, or do they have to pay rent? And then the political composition, which is the most important, is the knowledge of how workers are organized politically and how can they exert demands drawing from their own knowledge of the technical and social compositions. In Marxism, I guess, in dialectics, one of the things we have to focus on is that for a lot of things there is both a subjective and an objective aspect. So in terms of class, Marx spoke of the class in itself and the class for itself. The class in itself is the more objective sociological phenomenon of how workers relate to the means of production. But the class for itself is how the working class can develop consciousness over time. So the technical and social composition are the more objective aspects, but the political composition must be developed through the method of workers' inquiry, for instance. But I think to understand, how much time do I have?
You have about 5-6 minutes.
Okay, cool. But I think we also need to think of a synthesis between the more abstract and more concrete theories. But I'm going to go a little bit into thinking about the knowledge factory, because I actually wrote a critique of President Michael Crow's vision for ASU, which he called the New American University, and also he takes a lot of inspiration from Clark Kerr, who was the president of Berkeley in the 50s and 60s, who created what he called the multiversity, which was essentially the university, but it was very integrated with industry, with the military-industrial complex, things like that. But I think in order to construct the whole, which is what theory should be, understanding our conditions so that we can navigate them and hopefully win the class struggle, win the class war, we have to take inspiration from many theories. So old theories from both bourgeois and socialist perspectives, in fact most of the socialists were bourgeois, such as Smith, Marx, Lenin, Kerr, and dare I say Michael Crow, should be combined with more concrete workers' perspectives. Marxism is not about understanding, right, mechanical assemblages of unrelated parts. It's starting from the whole. And we can approach this by connecting the concrete to the abstract and the universal to the particular. So I mentioned, but I've written a critique, The Mind of Michael Crow, which analyzes his vision of the New American University. He wrote a book about this, Designing the New American University, in 2015. And I was inspired by Hal Draper's work, The Mind of Clark Kerr, which critiqued the Cold War university. And Clark Kerr is a very interesting figure because he was liberal compared to the previous administrators. He was actually a member of the Student League of Industrial Democracy, which eventually became SDS, but he also crushed the free speech movement. But in Hal Draper, he was involved in the student movement in the 30s. He was involved with third camp Trotskyism. But he also inspired the main leader of the free speech movement, Mario Savio. And The Mind of Clark Kerr focuses on Kerr's hypocrisy, how he says the university should be increasingly connected with industry, but he thinks that students should not focus on off-campus issues, sort of that hypocrisy. But yeah, so we can take these abstract theories and we should critique them, right? But we also need to get more concrete with workers' inquiry. So Sfadasu recently has begun a workers' inquiry. We've emailed thousands of ASU workers about job precarity and threats to their academic freedom. And really, this is an essential part for creating a rank and file union for faculty. Because UCW does exist, but United Campus Workers, but it is pre-majority and therefore it's not recognized under the Wagner Act. And also we want it to be a more democratic rank and file union.
2 more minutes.
Okay. I won't go over all of this, but I think one thing I'd like to focus on is how there was a brief period of time that capitalism seemed to be stable, the post-war boom. But this was not and a lot of Keynesian social democrats, reformists, people like that, think that it's because of the New Deal. But really it was because of the massive capital destruction during World War II. Because capitalism, as it evolves, it has this problem of overaccumulation, which I'm not going to go too deep into it, but essentially World War II, by destroying Western Europe, a lot of the industry there, it cleared up space for capital to grow, but eventually crises reemerged in the 1970s. And from then, we had the long downturn. And I think because of this, Marxism sort of has been in a crisis, along with, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union, things like that, but also the question of the industrial working class, because when people think about the working class organizing, they're usually not thinking about like service sector workers. And neoliberalism attempted to revive capitalism, right, through exploiting workers more to raise the rate of profit, but this ultimately failed. A lot of recent theorists, especially left communists, they try to address these problems. So some of them focus more on the circulation of capital rather than the production of goods. But ultimately, I think the main point I want to get at is that it can't be taken for granted that we're going to have a rising industrial working class. It's a lot larger than it was, but it's also shrinking relative to overall population size. And this is a global trend. It's just the trend of automation globally. I don't have much more to say. But.
Awesome. Thank you, Henry. Appreciate that. We're going to move on to Paul's opening remarks, and I will start the timer when you begin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you about framing the discussion of capitalism, framing the critique of capitalism. Nowadays, it's easy to get overwhelmed by the barrage of terrible things that are happening in this country on a daily basis. Easy to get overwhelmed, easy to get confused, easy to get to the point where you lose focus on the bigger picture. Yet in fact, it is the bigger picture which is key to understanding all of the individual atrocities. They may appear to us separately and individually, but in fact, they're intimately interconnected. And the key is to identify that thing, that nexus, which unites them all. In 1965, Paul Potter, who was then the president of SDS, spoke to a rally against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C. And in his speech, Potter asked the audience this question: what kind of system is it that wages war in Vietnam, disenfranchises black people in the South, and condemns millions to a life of hunger, poverty, and homelessness. And then he went on to say, and now I'm going to quote you directly from his speech. He said, "We must name that system. We must name it, describe it, analyze it, understand it, and change it. For it is only when that system is changed and brought under control that there can be any hope for stopping the forces that create a war in Vietnam today, or a murder in the South tomorrow, or all the incalculable, innumerable, more subtle atrocities that are worked on people all over, all the time." Well, folks, I hate to tell you, but if you don't know, the name of this system is capitalism. And we too have an obligation, a duty, to analyze it, to describe it, to name it, to critique it, and most importantly of all, to change it. The future of this planet and our very lives depend upon it. Framing, if it's effective, is one way to do these things. So tonight, for your consideration, I'm going to offer you 3 different ways of framing the discussion of capitalism. First frame, I call it the capitalism and crime frame. I have long argued that capitalism is a system of organized crime masquerading as civilization. The great English bourgeois economist John Maynard Keynes knew this. He said, "Capitalism is based on the astonishing belief that the most wickedest of men will act for the most wickedest of reasons for the greatest good of everybody." I would suggest to you that the class of those most wickedest of men, the capitalist class, is composed of 2 wings. The legal wing, consisting on mainstream legitimate capitalists, and the illegal wing, consisting of the mafia and various other criminal gangs, networks, and cartels. I would also suggest to you that the decay, decline, and corruption of American capitalism in the last few decades has resulted in a situation where the 2 wings of the capitalist class are increasingly coming to resemble one another in the way they think, in the way they act, in the way they operate. And of course, today we have a president who embodies and epitomizes the absolutely worst features of both wings of the capitalist class. Rosa Luxemburg said, "The choice before humanity is socialism or barbarism." We may not here all agree on a shared vision of what socialism would look like, but today it is certainly clear what barbarism is. Okay, my second frame, I call this the capitalism in Arizona frame. In order to understand the current crisis in Arizona, we need to understand what capitalism has done to us. Marxism teaches that the history of American capitalism is characterized by uneven regional development. For much of its modern history, Arizona, like many other parts of the West, was treated as a virtual third world colony within the United States, ruthlessly exploited for its natural resources. Look at Bisbee, look at Globe, look at Clifton Morenci. Billions of dollars of mineral resources were drawn and extracted from the mines in those communities. And what do those communities have to show for it today? Nothing. Eastern capital grew richer, Arizona grew poorer. And we are still living with the legacy of that history today. Arizona consistently ranks as one of the least affordable states in the country. And Tucson, the city where I live, which is surrounded by mines that produced untold wealth in minerals, is listed consistently as one of the poorest big cities in the country. Arizona is now at a crossroads. We are facing an existential crisis, a crisis of climate, a crisis of water. Make no mistake, capitalism is the primary cause of this crisis. Capitalism is also the major impediment to its solution. Unless checked, climate change promises rising temperatures across our state and the exacerbation of our already critical water crisis. Capitalism's dependence on the burning of fossil fuels is the major driver of climate change. Capitalism's refusal to break its addiction to coal, oil, and gas is the principal roadblock to us making any progress on addressing climate change. And the water crisis, like the climate crisis, is one of capitalism's making. From the beginning, capital has ruthlessly exploited Arizona's water resources for its own benefit, without regard to the long-term interests of the state's environment or the state's peoples. Water for ranching, water for mining, water for agriculture, water for real estate development and land speculation, and now water for data centers. Each of the fractions of capital that grew wealthy from Arizona's water are now fighting tooth and nail against any attempt to curb or regulate their water use. Whether or not the Sonoran Desert can sustain urban communities the size of Tucson and Phoenix in 50 or 100 years is an open question. But make no mistake about it, the answer to that question will depend in no small part on the extent to which we the people are able to bring capitalism to heel. Third and last frame. I call this frame Capitalism and the Vampire. In his great work, the book entitled Capital, Karl Marx repeatedly invokes the image of the vampire in discussing capitalism. Capital, Marx says, is dead labor that vampire-like drinks the blood of living labor. And in another passage, he says, the vampire capital will not loosen its hold on its worker victim as long as there is a muscle, a nerve, a drop of blood to be exploited. Along these lines, I would suggest to you that capitalism is one long, never-ending horror movie in which we are all trapped. Trapped, that is, unless and until we are willing and able to drive a wooden stake through the monster's heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We're going to move on to Bobby Nichols, our final panelist, for his opening remarks.
Thank you all for having me here today. Thank you for that. Can I just give my time to Paul? That was incredible. No, but I come at this from the perspective of somebody who doesn't have a deep history in academics of socialism or academics of communism. I have come to capitalism, an understanding of capitalism through work in the political arena and attempting to address material conditions that are put before me and the people who I attempt to serve. But I will answer the questions as directly as I possibly can. And I will not be coming up with these answers on my own. In fact, I would suggest that everybody go and buy the book, The Origins of Capitalism by L. Mexican Woods. I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it is a truly illuminating book that is also very dense and very, very important for people to get an understanding of what we're dealing with here. But I'll quote from that in establishing first what capitalism is, second, why we should oppose it, and third, how I have attempted to oppose it in the work that I do and the work that I attempt to continue to do. So capitalism at the very basest level is a system in which goods and services, down to the most basic necessities of life, are produced for profitable exchange, where even human labor power is a commodity for sale in the market, and where all economic actors are dependent on that market. This is true not only of workers who must sell their labor power for a wage, but also of capitalists who depend on the market to buy their inputs, including labor power, and to sell their output for profit. And this differs from other social forms because producers depend on the market for access to the means of production, unlike, for instance, peasants who remain in direct non-market possession of land, while appropriators cannot rely on extra economic powers of appropriation by means of direct coercion, but must instead engage on and depend upon the purely economic mechanisms of the market. The distinct systems of market dependence mean that the requirements of competition and profit maximization are the fundamental rules of life. Because of those rules, capitalism is a system uniquely driven to improve productivity of labor by technical means. And above all, it is a system in which the bulk of society's work is done by propertyless laborers who are obliged to sell their labor power in exchange for a wage in order to gain access to the means of life and labor itself. This brings forward one of the main issues that I have when I'm engaging with people to talk about capitalism. I go out and knock on doors and tell people that I'm a democratic socialist every day at this point. And every single day, at least 2 or 3 people ask me, well, hasn't that never worked anywhere? What even is the system that you're talking about? And why is this not working for us? And I would say at its core, what I try to appeal to is people's sense of autonomy and in a very American sense, appealing to people's desire to have a sort of abstract freedom. And you lay forward the way in which capitalism was established through what's sometimes discussed as primitive accumulation, which is essentially just the mass theft of resources from populations across the world by people who have, as Paul was saying just a moment ago, the worst possible intentions, the worst possible people pretending to dress up their conquests and their exploitations in a way that makes them seem the victors of history rather than just people who have come along and stolen everything from all of us and held us back. The reason why so capitalism in and of itself, very, very straightforward. It is a process of theft which is legalized and has been used to generate massive exploitation, which trickles down in a very, very unreal or unequal way to the average person who then faces the crises of climate, the crises of criminalization, the crises of alienation and exploitation consistently in their day-to-day lives, causing a lower standard of living than we should have across the board, but especially in extra exploited or hyper exploited populations in the global south at this time in history. The reason why we need to always fight back against this is, well, first of all, this is going to completely destroy the planet that we live on. We will all die, and that's not dramatic. It's just the truth of the matter. We face an existential crisis, not just in Arizona, but on the planet that we live on right now, and whether capitalism kills us by making the world too warm for us to survive, or through nuclear destruction, or through diseases that are unchecked because of the profit motive that comes with holding and hoarding patents for cures, it will get us eventually if we don't do exactly what was said just a moment ago and put a stake through its heart in the long run. And my work has been attempting to get people to just come to that realization that we live in a world that is not intended to work for you. It is intentionally set up this way. It was set up this way about 600 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that. Capitalism is not this sort of inherent human thing that comes about because of inherent greed or inherent competition or anything about humanity. The tendencies of humanity in a vacuum are towards community and empathy and support. The system of capitalism that we live under now and the processes that it creates to maintain the exploitation are anathema to human existence and to human, what I believe is the core of humanity. And so to get rid of that, you have to start appealing to people in a place where they can feel the problem. And in America, in Arizona, you hit it at a couple of different levels. So first of all, people don't have the basic needs in terms of medicine, in terms of food, in terms of housing. Those top level things, shelter, food, and medical support are inaccessible to the vast majority of people who live and work in America. And this is a place where you can start to tell people, if a society truly worked for you, you would have these basic things. Like, what do you think we need to ensure in Arizona, and Arizona is a good example of this, that we have long-term sustainable life in this state beyond the next 20 years. And you're gonna need a system where we have air conditioning for everyone, essentially. This is a very Arizona specific issue, but it brings up an issue that, or brings up a situation that you can expand out on when you're engaging with the average sort of person to tell them, essentially to make them aware of their material conditions. Because this is the greatest accomplishment of capitalism, is establishing itself as an inevitability and establishing itself as the best possible option that was given to us. And that has taken years and years and years of constant propaganda, of constant domination of social spaces, of murder of the people who would have brought that popular education to the working masses, and not just in America, but around the world. And we need to identify that as what it truly is. It is a reign of terror inflicted upon us by the most powerful, wealthiest, greediest people who have ever existed in the history of humanity, and they're never gonna give it up on their own. And so as was mentioned before, I do electoral work. So I'm an attorney, and I work for the state, and I have worked to develop policies and write laws and all of this. And I've found that where I can engage with people, what I can do for this movement is begin the political education process, get people into the concept of we deserve a better world, and we can have it. It requires a lot of hard work, and you don't necessarily start off with the mom you met when you were knocking on doors by telling her that the last capitalist we killed will be the one who, or the last capitalist we hang will be the one who sold us the rope. But it implies itself by the contradiction of continued capitalism, continued life on Earth. People want to assume that the average person, even the wealthiest person, has an inner goodness that will prevent them from carrying out these atrocities on the long term. And it doesn't take long to sort of break that down, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to view it. But so I'm rambling a little bit. I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to be in space with such incredibly brilliant minds and to get to talk to everybody here today about what I've done in order to use myself as a tool for this movement, identify the privileges that I've had in my life. I've had the privilege to go to law school. I've had the privilege to work for city council members. I've had that privilege to work within a movement like the Democratic Socialists of America, which is a movement that contains a legion of socialist ideologies and anarchist ideologies, from Marxists to SOCDEMs, to the extent that we want to call social democrats actually a Marxist ideology. But there is a purpose to engaging with people on that level, and that purpose is the beginning of political education. And so finding a way to continue to build out that movement by bringing people in and then showing them that there is a community they can turn to when they are experiencing these crises that are pushed upon them by the capitalist model. By building parallel systems of material provision for the average everyday person, whether it's through mutual aid or it's through union organizing, or it's through pushing back to win whatever we can to benefit the material condition of working people, while still acknowledging and always reminding people that you will not have these things if you stop fighting for them, because we still live under the domination of a class that wants to take this away from you. And every concession we win from the capitalists will remain temporary until we have completely removed them from the position of power and installed what is a genuine dictatorship of the proletariat that actually has the ability to lock down these wins. But it's good for people to know that a better world is possible. And the best way to show them that is by showing it to them. And so that's ultimately my theory, my thesis, that you have your own unique skills. You have whatever you do that makes you a unique organizer is valuable to this movement. And even if you're not building barricades, you can still have a valuable impact on the development of an anti-capitalist movement in America. And I'll close with a very cliche quote that I still love very much, that I like to remind people of when they sort of have an issue with believing that we can have that better world that we all deserve. And I'm sure you've all heard this before, but it's by Ursula K. Le Guin, and she said once that we live under capitalism and its power seems inescapable, but so do the divine right of kings. And I'll close on that.
Thank you, Bobby. Everyone give it up for our three panelists. We are now going to move into the response section of the panel. Where starting with Henry, each panelist will have about 3 to 5 minutes, or as little as they want up to that point, to respond to everything the other panelists have said before we move into the Q&A. So with that said, Henry, please begin.
I thought it was more like, could I ask panelists the other panelists questions that they can answer?
If they're brief, sure, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask Bobby, since I know you're running as a Democrat. Or
it's a nonpartisan race.
oh, really?
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more of the details on that, but I guess you mentioned stuff about building parallel structures. How does that relate to, your electoral work? Because I guess I am a bit skeptical of that, since there isn't like a mass socialist party in America. There is the DSA, but it's more of a Big Ten organization. So
yeah,
that's one thing I'm curious. Also, Paul, you mentioned a lot of stuff about, I guess, uneven development with Arizona. So, but I think, so you think it's mainly being treated as like a place for resource extraction, right? Are there any other?
Well, I was careful to say for much of its modern history.
Okay.
Because I think post-World War II, there's a whole other dynamic at play where the federal government invested an enormous amount in putting in military bases, in putting in infrastructure, because the United States was preparing at that point to assume world domination. And the Pacific region was critical to that. And so building up the infrastructure of the West With the bases you have here, the bases we have outside of Tucson, that was a separate dynamic. But for much of the earlier period, resource extraction was the dominant mode in which Eastern capital related to the West, was my argument.
And then I can jump in with
Yeah.
the initial question. And I think the way that I view that electoral work as squared with the assistance of developing parallel systems of resource provision that allow for working people to develop new ways to care for their basic material needs. It relates directly to a movement that's going on around the country that has been sort of spearheaded by Donald Trump, and especially relates to the making life worse for unhoused populations who can really be considered part of like the lumpen proletariat that we have in this country. And that's by the making illegal of mutual aid. And so Tempe's a really good example of this. They have passed, or they attempted in July of last year to pass a law that would have made it essentially illegal for mutual aid organizers to manage food distribution events in city parks, which is where all of these things happen. That was something that, as members of the DSA, we've been organizing mutual aid events in Daly Park, which is right by here, for the last 3 years. It's called the Really, Really Free Market. And I can tell you one of the dynamics about DSA, just nationally, every single chapter has a really strong mutual aid organization because it is essentially the lowest hanging fruit that you can get somebody into on their political education journey. Everybody knows that unhoused people are experiencing food insecurity. Everybody wants to do something about that. Providing that space allows for people to do those things better. And one of the big conflicts in DSA chapters is often the electoral work conflicting with the mutual aid work or dividing resources.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I've really tried to be intentional about, and to be very transparent, I am a part of a Marxist-Leninist vanguardist movement or committee within DSA, or caucus within DSA, called Red Star. And so we view DSA as the sort of proto, in embryo, workers' party that could be developed outwards. And so in order to use that work to combine those movements and bring it together, what we did in Tempe last year in July was organize our electoral work alongside our mutual aid work to put that ordinance that they had created on the ballot. We gathered some 5,000 signatures in 30 days in the July heat to force the council to rescind the ordinance that they had passed. And it was during that time that it sort of became clear that this would be a moment where we could continue to build out our capacity through another electoral campaign. And my experience as somebody who'd worked in a city council space before, as somebody who'd been a leader at the Phoenix DSA for the last 5-ish, 6-ish years, and then somebody who had worked to develop the chapter from about 400 members to nearly 1,000 members now, gave me the opportunity to step forward and do this. And I have personal reasons for having chosen to run as well. But did I kind of answer the question?
So I guess you would distinguish yourself from like Mamdani, because he ran as a Democrat.
Yeah, well, he also voted for himself on the Working Families Party line.
We can get into more like back and forth in the Q&A section. Do you have anything else you want to say about their opening remarks?
No.
All right. We'll move to Paul.
Thank you. I commend my fellow panelists for actually attempting to do a proper theoretical definition of capitalism in their remarks. When I first began to think about what to say here, I tried to do that. And I quickly became completely overwhelmed. You can talk about capitalism as a world system. You can talk about capitalism as a class system. You can talk about capitalism as a gendered system. You can talk about capitalism as racial capitalism. I mean, if you want to do a dialectical presentation on the nature of this monster, you can go on forever. And so I didn't even attempt that and hoped that the way I was doing it by presenting these frames to talk about it to people in a way that doesn't overwhelm them with this enormous theoretical baggage is another way to do it. But as I said, I commend the panelists for actually tackling that very complex problem and producing a presentation of it for everyone here today.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. And then Bobby?
I would sort of echo Paul's commending of everybody up here on this panel today. I really appreciated how you both brought a historical knowledge to this work that, as somebody who's more meat and potatoes, I guess you could call it, I really do appreciate the history of this movement. And it reminds me, and I hope it does remind everybody, that we're part of a very proud movement, a very important movement that goes back centuries now, and it's just really inspiring to see that people have gotten such a deep understanding of this and are continuing to ask these hard questions, even though we live in an age now where things are becoming more and more alienated, more and more difficult to engage with each other on these issues. I particularly appreciated your applying this to our immediate reality here at ASU and taking on something that I can tell you most people in Tempe city government are unwilling to address, period, and that's the power of Michael Crow, genuinely. And I really appreciated how you were able to take this to Arizona specifically, but also for both of you to name the murderous elements of capitalism that we face right now, and to not, move around the issue except to say that this will kill us and we really shouldn't address that any other way. And I'm happy to get back into the sort of more in depth of the my theory on electoralism, my theory on what Zoran has done, my theory on how that benefits people, what it doesn't do that's effective. But I think that'd be better served for
The Q&A.
the Q&A.
I'm sure it'll come
Yeah.
up. Awesome, thanks so much. One more round of applause for our three panelists before the Q&A. All right, so for the Q&A section, we are going to just call on people, raise your hand. I will call on you. You can stand up if you'd like or not. Ask the question to either one or all or any number of the panelists, and we can do that for a while. So, questions? I'm so sorry, I forgot your name. Miles.
Yeah, Miles.
Awesome.
This is a question for all the panelists. How do you think colonialism ties into the history of capitalism, and do you think that socialism will actually be able to, I guess, heal the wound that colonialism has caused to the world?
Okay.
Yeah, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, I think colonialism, it was an initial part of primitive accumulation, both other than that, you also had the enclosures in England, but for the Americas, you had settler colonialism, you had colonialism in Africa. I think one of the important things is just recognizing that there's not like a simple way to go backwards, if you know what I mean. But also, like, when colonialism, right, when Lenin talks about imperialism, he's talking about when the European empires were colliding, late 19th, right, leading up to World War I, that created its own contradiction, which was supposed to end capitalism.
Well, yeah, I would say, I mean, if people want to really seriously study this issue, there's a wonderful debate going on now through Jacobin magazine, because Vivek Chibber came out and said, oh no, it really didn't have that much to do. And of course, all kinds of people have correctly pushed back. Colonialism was absolutely essential. Marx in Capital goes into considerable detail about how the wealth generated by colonialism was a major driver of the growth of Europe and European power throughout, the history from Columbus on. Secondly, the question is that once the world system was created and became, fully capitalized, the inequalities between the rich countries and the poor countries reproduced a dynamic where the rich countries got richer and the poor got poorer. So even long past colonialism, neocolonialism, if you want to call it whatever, these same fundamental inequalities are reproducing the wealth of the richer countries and the poverty of the poorer countries. So yes, if socialism cannot destroy the world capitalist system as a system predicated on inequality, then socialism will be a failure and will be no better than capitalism. Everyone who is committed to the socialist idea has got to be committed to, number one, the breakdown of that system, and two, I would argue, a fundamental world system of reparations for all of those countries and peoples who were victimized by colonialism, imperialism, and this unequal system for all those centuries, so that we can begin to redress the inequalities concretely in the world.
I think it's really important to acknowledge that even though colonialism did play a significant and essential role in the development of our current capitalist system, and it is ongoing, we are still seeing colonial movements in Palestine, and the expansion of the Israeli state through the Zionist project is a very direct expansion of European colonialism, which has transitioned its epicenter from London to New York to wherever, but ultimately it is a global dictatorship of capital, which uses these outposts to establish domination over areas where they can have the most potential exploitation to bring back in. And so when we look at the way that our current leaders are reacting to this just naked terror that is being inflicted upon Palestinian people, and now inflicted upon people, or for decades inflicted upon the people in Lebanon, inflicted upon Iran, and these systems that have, and Iran is an especially good example as a nation that, despite what it has done in the last several decades and the human rights abuses which do exist, that's not necessarily an issue. The reality is they are one of the only nations in the world that threw off American and European capitalist domination. They exist within that system, but the revolutionary movement that took power in Iran is and has always been an incredible target of Western capitalism, in the same way that Cuba is a massive target of Western capitalism, because it proves for people that these colonized nations can rise up, take back what is theirs, and cast off the chains of capitalism. What comes after that is what comes after that. But like in our immediate, the reality is these examples of how we could do away with the colonial system, the colonial model, the capitalists are now attempting to make them examples of what happens when you push back against capitalism. And so this is one of the reasons why, when in early conversations that I had about, let me frame it this way. So in my race, which has absolutely nothing to do with Israel or Palestine, I have been actively smeared by Zionists from day fucking one. Pardon my language. There are people who live in Tempe or who live in Ahwatukee who know that I'm a member of DSA. They live in Ahwatukee. They don't live in Tempe. Who know that I'm a member of DSA and know that we recently passed at the last convention a resolution that says we are going to create a system by which we will expel open Zionists and people who are unwilling to take political education. And I was very, very supportive of that. I was supportive of that back in 2023 when it failed, and now I was supportive of it again over the 2 years in between conventions to 2025, where it finally passed. That became sort of national news because of the Zionist movement, which is a nationalist, colonialist, fascist movement that is very intentionally designed to continue the exploitation of this resource-rich area for global capital. It has adherents across the world, and those adherents identify their enemies basically immediately, and I have no shame in saying that I am their enemy, and they identified me as their enemy very early on. And so finding a way to consistently remind people, use this rather than deflecting from it, rather than pretending like it wasn't happening, but to at all times use this as an opportunity to do political education and show people this is what happens when you run on these principles. When you try to step forward and propose even a better world, you will face this sort of backlash. But the fact that they're so pressed about it shows that we can do something, and they know we can.
Thank you very much. The gentleman next to Diego, you had your hand raised?
Yes, I did. Question for Paul specifically, or maybe more of comment and followed by one very quick fun question. But the substantive question I was going to ask is specifically your capitalism as a crime framework. I specifically want to relate this to gangsterism, which if you like really look at what their value system is, it's nearly indistinguishable from both capitalist values as well as like, you know, police values. And I would argue it is exactly what you said, is because like, you know, those sort of gangsterism are just like the illegal wing versus the legal wing. But in particular, I want to bring up, you know who actually pointed this out? It was surprisingly, it was Obama saying that, you know, bunch of gangster rappers become Republicans as soon as, you know, they leave that life. And unfortunately, like, he didn't connect it as a, like, he just said it as more of a Republican is bad sort of thing, rather than, no, it's like these things are like basically indistinguishable. The only difference is that with the gangsters, like, they've been denied entry into the legal wing, so they try to go into the illegal wing. And also, because they don't have the monopoly of force of the state, they themselves have to like enforce it themselves. And as far as the fun question I had, because, you know, Marx has a lot of passages of like, you know, monsters and specters and vampires. Would you say that, you know, he could be considered a gothic horror author?
Well, I mean, I think the Gothic horror elements are very important in his work because he was very plugged in to the culture of his time. And that was a period when that kind of literature was very much in vogue. And yeah, Marx is, I mean, if you read the biographies of Marx, Marx memorized whole plays of Shakespeare. He used to recite to his daughters, you know, Macbeth and, you know, all this stuff. I mean, he was just an incredibly brilliant person. And not only was he plugged into all this stuff, but he integrated it into his work as well. So yeah, I mean, I think you can read Marx's work, Capital, strictly as an economic text, or you can read it as a cultural work, or you can read it as a political manifesto. I mean, there are hundreds of readings can be done of this kind of stuff. And it's just a tribute to his genius.
I mean, for anybody running any book clubs, if, you know, you can probably sneak in some passages from Marx in the, for anybody in like, if the themes is Gothic horror. Just some strategy too.
Much appreciated. Next question, we'll go with August.
This is for everyone. I was wondering, what features of contemporary capitalism do you think are unique to today as opposed to how it has been analyzed in the past, and how that changes how we're supposed to fight against it going forward?
What features are what?
Unique to contemporary capitalism.
I guess I can start. In terms of, I mean, some thinkers have talked about like techno-feudalism or neo-feudalism. Like Jodi Dean, for instance, she recently published something about neo-feudalism, and she argues that capitalism is increasingly dependent upon rents, not just like ground rent, but also like rent on intellectual property. And monopolization, although you could also argue that that goes back to like Lenin's analysis of imperialism, but even she acknowledges it's still capitalism. So I think we can observe changes as long as we recognize that it's not something completely new.
Well, to me, I think the feature that I find most striking is the qualitatively greater degree to which contemporary capitalism has become irrational. Look at the climate issue. I mean, again, when the bourgeoisie was progressive, they would have immediately devoted all their resources to figuring out how to prevent climate change, how to avoid the consequences of those kinds of problems. Today, the bourgeoisie has a death wish. I mean, look at the fact. Who did they put in charge of the country? A senile, demented kleptocrat who's completely incapable of coming up with a rational idea or a rational plan for anything. What kind of system is it that would put at the apex of power in a country a figure like Donald Trump? So to me, it raises the issue of just, if the system is that irrational, if the system is that dangerous, then yeah, the challenge to us is enormous. Because we could reason with a reasonable bourgeoisie. With a bourgeoisie that's completely beyond the reach of reason, I mean, other than strict force, what tools do we have to deal with these people? That to me is what I find most significant.
Well, when would you say the bourgeoisie stopped being progressive, or it stopped being rational?
Well, it was always a degree of irrationality, obviously. I had this debate with Herbert Aptheker once. When was American capitalism last progressive? And I think the argument, we ended up agreeing that American capitalism was last progressive during the Reconstruction period. The defeat of Reconstruction and the Spanish-American War, one ended the progressiveness internally, and the second ended the progressiveness externally. So the period from the 1870s to the 1890s was the end of when American capitalism was progressive. In other countries, depending on how later or earlier they came to capitalism, each one probably had a different date.
I think I would say if I were going to identify a specifically unique feature, it would be a diffusion of responsibility that has come with the increased implementation of corporate practices and corporatization within the capitalist system. So rather than having individual capitalists who are dominating their own area or owning a monopoly, or it's within a family, the shareholder structure has diffused responsibility for the crimes and atrocities to such a degree that people are, when they're in that, the bourgeoisie are no longer identifying themselves individually as the creators of this sort of misery. And I think it leads to the formation of the current capitalist anti-humanist death cult that we see, which is best exemplified through people like Peter Thiel, who has essentially established that he doesn't really believe that humanity can be saved or humanity should be saved, and believes that if he himself can escape, it's not his responsibility to take care of any of the problems that arise as a result of the system which has benefited him so extraordinarily greatly. But I think that goes back to when capitalism was last progressive, and the systems that were put in place to increase the diversification of financial instruments and then use that to diffuse responsibility for atrocities.
Awesome. This question, we're going to do Val, Jacob, and Cass in that order, one at a time, obviously, but Valerie.
Just I just want to comment on the diffusion of responsibility. I think SAW 6 had a healthcare CEO presented with essentially denying claims decisions, but it was instead human mousetraps. But yeah, we've definitely been trying to figure that one out for a while. I wanted to pose a bit of a challenge to, because everyone has kind of gone through the evils of the system, how they manifest, but I want to look at this through a historical lens. So how has capitalism served as a progressive force in history, and how can we determine that it has outlived its usefulness? Because it was able to accomplish a level of societal development that we had never seen before. Are we how can we be certain that that period has ended? And this is for anyone.
I'll sort of just take my first crack at this one, and then I'll pass it on to the people who have better academic understanding of this. I would say that, and similar to what is written in The Origins of Capitalism. Capitalism exists as a constantly, a force of constant technological improvement over the resources that are put forward. And it does that to the detriment of everything else around it. But you could say that the reason we know there was a necessity to some degree for the creation of these technological improvements, or technological, not even referring necessarily to the development of certain things that are technologies, but in practices in developing of resources and whatnot, is that there was a period of time in human history where we could have faced famines as a global society, we could have faced climate crises as a global society, and had nothing that we as humans could do about it. The developments that humanity created and the workers created while dominated by the capitalist system has changed that, where we do have now enough food to feed everybody in the world, and we do have enough housing to house everybody in the world. And the reason we know that this system has outlived its usefulness is because even though we have the resources to take care of these things, we are not doing that. And the reason we're not doing that is because a few people get to dominate all of the benefits that come out of the technological improvements that the workers created under the capitalist system.
Well, yeah, I mean, you read the Communist Manifesto, it's a long paean to how wonderful capitalism was by comparison to feudalism. The tremendous revolutions in technology, economics, science, fields of knowledge across the board, all of that was the product of capitalism. The question of outliving its usefulness is very, very interesting, because if you read the history of Marxist thought, over and over and over again, Marxists predicted the end of capitalism. Lenin, the highest stage of capitalism, like there was going to be no further stage. You remember Ernest Mandel wrote a book called Late Capitalism? Like, you know, is the end? I mean, all this stuff was predicated on the idea that there was some kind of historical inevitability that was going to lead to capitalism's end. And I always call people's attention to the passage in the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels, they start by saying the history of all hitherto existing societies is a history of class struggle. But then they go on to say, in each prior historical period, the class struggle culminated in either the revolutionary reorganization of society or in the mutual ruin of the contending classes. So Marx and Engels were absolutely clear. There is no guarantee that capitalism will end, will outlive its usefulness. The monster will continue to morph. You know those horror movies where the monster is one shape and then it becomes another and another and another? That's capitalism for you. The monster will continue to morph until either we develop the strength to overthrow it, or it destroys all of us in a planetary cataclysm. That's the choices. But yet, for the longest period, it continued to produce new technology. All this new technology with, you know, AI and whatever is just the latest sign that capitalism is capable of reinventing itself, of capable of new forms of technology and knowledge which give it a new lease on life. And I think we have to be frank and realize, and we have to look back and say, the wishful thinking of prior Marxists was nothing more than wishful thinking.
I mean, I guess what I'd say is if it's progressive or it's not progressive, then progressing towards what? I think you can only say it was progressive in retrospect. If we were to have a revolution and we saw that all of the technologies that were built up by capitalism were used in, I don't know, a more human way, then we would say, oh, well, it was progressive. But since the revolutions failed, it's not progressive, I guess. So I guess I kind of disagree with the framework.
All right, next question is Jacob.
Yeah, my name is Jacob. I'm from the Revolutionary Communists of America. This question is primarily aimed for Bobby. So while you do call yourself a socialist first, my primary question for you is why you run as a Democrat, which although I know you said you're unpartisan, your website has you running as a Democrat. The Democrats have consistently obviously been a ruling class party, one for the capitalists that has consistently served them. Ultimately speaking, while the DSA itself is one of the largest, if not the largest, socialist organizations or groups, I suppose, in the US, what exactly is stopping you guys from creating an independent workers' party, one that's actually capable of not only fighting back against capitalism, but not necessarily actually needing the Democrats to assist them in these electoral things and actually be able to mobilize and organize the workers independently from them?
So, second question first, critical mass. There's 100,000 members of DSA on a good day. That's simply not enough to actually put forward a true party system that will actually change the structure and challenge the duopoly in a way that is meaningful. We could go out and do those things now. We could have people running on just DSA party lines or ballot lines at this exact moment. But that would also assume that DSA is a monolith in the way it is approaching this work, and that's just not the case. For me, it's a matter of there is a immediate benefit in Tempe to identifying myself as a Democrat because of the way that people are registered in this city and the fact that the vast majority of America has no clue what it means to be an anarchist versus a socialist versus a Marxist-Leninist. And having that on the label is politically toxic in the environment. So in order to engage with a population that has no political education and push them towards an understanding that the world we are fighting for is possible without naming it in a way that makes them run away and hide behind their Red Scare histories and propaganda, it's playing with kid gloves, unfortunately. And do I wish I could play without the kid gloves? I absolutely do. But at this point, in order to build the movement that I view the DSA as doing, there is a level of needing to continue to use those kid gloves, in America at least, where everybody has been so tainted by the reactionary propaganda for the last 200 years. I think that's sort of the broad strokes of it. I mean, when people ask me directly, like, are you running as a Democrat? I answer the question right there. Like, I want to win this race, so I put forward on the website that I am a registered Democrat, and I am a registered Democrat because I believe that I can use that platform to vote in primaries, essentially, which allows for that work to continue and to do political education around people who would otherwise have a very passive engagement with the system they exist within. And that's just the reality, unfortunately. You know, the vast majority of people in America, when they hear the word Marx, when they hear the name Marx, when they hear the name Lenin, they're not thinking about the sort of revolutionary, victorious people who have moved society and the world in a good direction because of the decades and decades of Red Scare propaganda. They're basically thinking that this is the same thing as Hitler. Like, that's not true. We all know that in this room. But in the same way that when you're working with an unhoused population, they're not going to be able to engage with you in good faith unless they trust you initially because you've spent the time engaging with them in a place that they can understand. People who have no political education beyond voting every 2 or 4 years are not going to be able to engage with the dialectical materialist analysis that is required to fully understand the movement towards communism and how it needs to be built out in America. And so where I think that there is a value to constantly using these platforms that we have in order to build out that political education, I'm very, very grateful that there are people who are doing work like RCA is doing to try and continue to build out a more direct educational approach as well.
Can I provide a follow-up question as well?
Sure.
I would first and foremost disagree in the fact that most people do not have the political, at least education, in the sense of understanding that the Democrats and Republicans are not a party that are actually capable of supporting the working class. In fact, I think it's something like 75% of Democrats consider themselves socialists or consider themselves in favor of socialism. On top of that, there's a Cato Institute poll that was also done where amongst people between the ages of 18 and 30, 62% of them have a favorable view of socialism and 34% of them have a favorable view of communism. ultimately that shows at least 1 in 3 people or 2 in 3 people at least have a favorable view of those sort of things. Ultimately, the DSA could run as a socialist party, one that's actually independent from these two that are actually capable of stepping forward. When we looked at the 2024 election, we didn't see a majority vote for either party. We actually saw a majority vote not voting. 67% of the population didn't vote. I think more so for that, when we actually look at things, you're saying, well, we can't just run as a socialist because people don't like socialists. Well,
Did
sure.
I say that you can't just run as a socialist?
What I mean is more so as a socialist party. What I'm saying though is instead, don't just say, oh, well, we'll move the goalposts as we get in there, provide a transitional program. Show people something that's actually capable of answering these questions ahead of time. Providing something like capping rent at 10% of minimum wage. Something like actually providing environmental solutions for things. Not investing in AI in those sort of ways, or at least not investing in them in the same capacity as going here.
And so my question then would be, do you believe those things are not being proposed by DSA?
I think that DSA consistently considers itself a political organization or a group, but very much steps away from the actual label of a political party. Which
Okay,
is something
because there has been specific resolutions passed within DSA within the last year that are actively designed to move it towards a party model. So I hear what you're saying, and you're just incorrect about the internal workings of DSA.
Well, until that point is put across, I'm simply wondering what it is that DSA is waiting for, at least ultimately. So I guess that's more so my
I would
preference for that.
go back to critical mass.
Fair enough.
All right, more questions? Cass?
Hi. So my question is mostly towards Bobby, but I kind of want to jump off of what has been said throughout the entire panel. When we're dealing with such a monster as an amorphous blob like John Carpenter's The Thing, that is capitalism, how do we handle a system that has not worked electorally, not worked legislatively, and also not worked by galvanizing a populace or militarizing a populace a la the civil rights movement? How do we actively not fall into reactionary violence as individuals when the violence is being committed against us on a daily basis?
Can you
Can you define that?
Can you define that a little bit better? I'm not, because on the one hand, I personally believe that we should have community defense systems as socialists who are going to be targeted by fascists, but I'm not sure that's what you're asking.
How do we prevent people, how do we make sure that individuals understand that there are like-minded people like them so that they do not go off by themselves?
So how do you avoid
How do you avoid
adventurism?
martyrs?
Yes, and that comes down to giving people, creating these communities. The real thing that stands between socialists and socialism is socializing. So finding a space to get people engaged with these communities, whether it's through picking low-hanging fruit, like creating mutual aid organizations, or running in a campaign where you're putting forward a socialist platform, and you're using that as a way to get people on board with these policies and then introduce them to people who are working within the socialist movement. It's really about community building more than anything there. The best way to prevent the nihilism that leads to adventurism is to developing communities that care for each other and are built on empathy and compassion and coordination, as opposed to allowing people to sort of hang out to dry under the exploitation and domination that is so deeply alienating. And then, of course, we're going to have fascists who want to do us harm, and that's why I own weapons.
All right, more questions? We'll go with Clint, this gentleman in the front row, and then the other RCA comrade. So Clint?
Thank you all. I've got two questions, and the second one's probably more important, but I want to start with the first question. And the first question is, what do you three make of ideology? What is ideology? And to make that more concrete, Henry, in his opening remarks, you said that there was a communist manifesto, there was never a capitalist manifesto. And Bobby said that capitalism started 600 years ago, and it was very intentionally sort of designed like this, right? Like it's the exploitation of labor. But to make that even more specific, is it as easy to say that American workers and workers in many countries don't want socialism because they've been lied to? And so for example, like Henry, you're trying to do a critique of Michael Crow's New University. And like in his own mind, he's not thinking like, okay, let me see how many workers can I exploit? Let me see how many people I can feed into the military industrial complex, right? Like in his mind, he's creating the most democratic university in American history, right? Where 90% of the people can actually get, the opportunities that they need to go and enter the labor force, right? And then Paul, you said that it's increasingly like gangster capitalism, right? But like, the millions of people who voted for Obama didn't think that they were voting for a gangster. The millions of people who were voting for Trump didn't think that they were voting for a gangster, right? So like millions of people, at a mass ideological level, in some sense still believe in this sort of bourgeois promise of emancipation through labor. And is that something as simple as like, oh, they've been lied to? I mean, I remember having this conversation with Lav, like, who actually still believes in the American dream? Well, it's the migrant laborers, right? That you can actually come up and like, work and create a better life for your child, and you can have certain like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That these like fundamental rights of the bourgeois revolution aren't just like things that some ruling class imposed on us to keep us as slaves, right? There was this, these bourgeois revolutions were something that were very bottom up. I mean, Bobby, you mentioned like the Ursula Le Guin quote, like the divine right of kings once seemed, and where did the divine right of kings go, right? The bourgeois revolution kind of swept it away and became capitalism and all of that. So how do we understand this question of like ideology? Like you go ask, like, why doesn't an American worker want socialism? Because it leads to the gulag, right? Like, it's just very, they don't want the gulag, so they don't want socialism, right? Like, there's a kernel of truth in that, right? Like, we can always point to the mass famine in India, all of these other sorts of things, but like, I guess, how do we specify this ideological question? I remember, Bobby, you said that, like, you start off with like the abstract freedom, right? Secondly, and this might actually be the more important question, something that Paul said, you said, if you're giving a dialectical presentation, you can go on forever. And so I'm in the interest of like dialectics not just going on until the sun explodes, because it was referenced earlier, when Lenin is doing imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is that not a dialectical critique, so to speak, of the history of socialism, right? It's not that imperialism is coming in from without, it's that the working class movement for socialism, i.e. the Second International, is beginning, the split within the emerging split within the Second International is actually posing the question of socialism at a world historical stage. So that in that sense that Lenin is writing the history of not just capitalism, but the history of Marxism as leading to the necessity of his moment, as leading to the necessity of taking revolution in the imperial core on the basis of the past 70 years of building up the socialist working class movement, the International Party. And then secondly, this is probably the more important question that this is pointing to, the New Left. Because Henry is explicitly orienting from the New Left, the SDS. Paul, I know that you knew all of the Marxist-Leninist groups that were coming about in the 70s in large response largely in response, correct me if I'm wrong, but largely in response to the failure of the New Left. And Bobby, You're coming from the DSA, which is of course coming out of that split in 71, the Harrington, the SPA is falling apart. Why does the New Left fail? Like where is the New Left coming from? Why does it fail? All right, so, you know, the Second International. Where does the Second International come from? What's the best thing the Second International created? Lenin, right? He's just totally born and bred in the Second International, right? This is the international Marxist movement, right? So like, if Lenin is reading the history of imperialism as the necessity of his moment, if the New Left is like reading their history as the necessity of their moment, why can't we seem to be doing anything like that today? Why is the left not reading its own history as the necessity of its moment? Is that desirable? And then, like, yeah, why does the New Left fail? So those are my two questions: ideology and why does the New Left fail? Or what is the New Left? Why does it fail?
So I think we'll have everyone answer this individually in speaking order to the best of their abilities. We'll start with Henry, Paul, Bobby.
Okay, so ideology, I was using it more in the colloquial sense, like oh, you can be a libertarian, you can be a communist, you can be a capitalist, right? Like, I mean, something people say is like supporters of capitalism call themselves capitalists, but capitalist initially just meant someone who owns capital. So that's what I mean. And I mean, there were conscious aspects of capitalism, like the revolutionary movement, I mean, Michael Crow is a conscious expression of capitalism. So in terms of like the Marxist sense, you know, the more technical sense of ideology, it's the ruling ideas. I'd say it's generally the rationalization for the status quo. So I think, like, there's libertarianism. That's kind of a rationalization of capitalism. But yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. In terms of the New Left, why does the New Left fail? Very complicated question, but I'd say the early New Left really focuses on, right, like the issues of civil liberties, university reform, things like that. I'd say part of it is the entryism, right? Like the Progressive Labor Party, I'm sure you're familiar, but they entered into SDS and other people in SDS expelled them, and it caused this like factional conflict from within, and they just cannibalized themselves. I'd say that's part of it. Another part is focusing too much on foreign policy. I do think it is important, and like Sfadasu condemns the war in Iran, but I don't think it's the central organizing point. And I think if it becomes, you know, anti-imperialism becomes your central organizing point, that leads to limits, and that's what happened with the SDS. So it's a variety of factors. But yeah.
Well, you didn't ask two questions, you asked like half a dozen questions. Well, all right, I will try to talk.
It was 3.
Whatever. I mean, let's start with ideology. The fact that a lot of people don't recognize gangster capitalism when they see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's been able to conceal itself very well from the masses of people. In terms of what is ideology, I mean, I have a bookshelf this wide full of books on ideology. I mean, the traditional Marxist analysis in Marxism's most primitive phase was it was false consciousness. And I don't think there's any serious Marxist today who buys that anymore. I'm a disciple of Louis Althusser, so I'm totally, in to Althusser's analysis of ideology as both an instance of the social formation and simultaneously a system for constructing individuals as political subjects. And when you add in Gramsci and his work on hegemony, you understand the particular role of ideology in the formation of political subjects and the reasons why so many political subjects believe the ideology of the dominant social formation, even though it works against their interests. Question of the New Left. There's an objective reason it failed, and there's a subjective, multiple objectives. But let me talk about the main one. The main objective reason was it was a student movement. It wasn't rooted in the working class or any permanent class level in society. These were young people in transition. They were young people in college. They were all going to get out and they were all going to go to the winds. And so there was not an objective core able to hold and sustain this. People graduated, new people came in, this constant flux. That was the objective factor. The subjective factor is, what did Lenin say? Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. The New Left was enormously eclectic. The New Left did not do its theoretical homework on analyzing fully the nature of the American capitalist social formation, the nature of American history, the nature of American ideology. All kinds of people started that work. But as a movement as a whole, it never became a sustained consciousness that welded people together and impelled them in a common direction to be politically effective. And so the combination of those factors and the internecine warfare that he referred to meant the end of it. The new communist movement, I'll tell you, I was in it, we had the exact same problems. So this is not to say, oh, the New Left, we can write them off, unlike the rest of us who really know what we're talking about. This is a chronic historical problem that has plagued the left. And then it's just the last comment. Lenin may have been a product of the Second International, but Lenin's genius came from rejecting the legacy and the teachings and the practice of the Second International. If he had remained a Second Internationalist, there never would have been a Bolshevik Revolution. What was, the Bolshevik Revolution was a rejection of the Marxism, the evolutionism of the Second International. Enough said.
I agree that that's enough said.
All right. Next we have the gentleman in the front row and then Andy in the back.
Yeah, so this time I have a quick question. In terms of some of the things mentioned before, we're talking about like foreign policy or like Paul mentioned one of his framings was like the unequal development and exploitation of certain regions for the benefit of others. And I was thinking in terms of like what a socialist movement would look like. In your opinion, would it be better in the US context to frame the socialist movement as an inherently American phenomenon or an international one?
Is that for all panelists?
Yeah.
Okay. Start with Bobby, come this way.
I think you have to do both. I think you have to appeal to people from a place of, on one hand, reclaiming the myths that they base their perspectives on, they base their identities on. And then on the other hand, you need to make sure that they're not falling into the trap of simply reliving the same traumas that caused capitalism to become so deeply entrenched here. I think that on one hand you have a revolutionary, like some potential for telling people that, hey, it is okay to go out and have an actual revolutionary movement inherent to the American mythology. And on the other hand, you absolutely cannot frame communism or socialism as a single state's thing, because it requires the international connection, it requires the international proletariat to stand up and actually do the work together.
Yeah, I agree with Bobby. It's got to be both. International because we're all human beings, and therefore we have something in common with all other human beings. But also there are additional forms of identity that are important to people, like national identity. I mean, we may complain about national chauvinism all we want, and we may look at the negative effects national chauvinism has played in all kinds of cultures, in all kinds of countries, at all kinds of times. But there is a positive dimension. This country was built by working people. What achievements were, produced by the blood and sweat of working people is a very valuable thing for people to be proud of. And if nationalism can be reconstructed in such a way that it becomes a positive identity, so that it's not, I'm a nationalist because I think my nation is better than everyone else's, but my nationalism and my nation's contribution to the world culture is something positive, then you can do both, and you can appeal both to people's sense as a human being and as an American, provided you're very careful about how you articulate this Americanness.
I'd say, so the question is national or international?
Yeah.
ASU level. I'd say we're all humans, but I mean, where are we right now? We're in the knowledge factory. And I think you have to start from the concrete conditions, but I don't think it's necessarily worth, taking up an American identity. At least that's how I've thought about it in my praxis.
So do you think that it's better for people here to think of themselves as like students who are eventually gonna be part of the working class? Is that your idea?
Yeah, sort of like the working class in motion, sort of. But yeah, thinking more about our ability to act, right?
And can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So, and going from what all of you have said, since the thinking of the socialist movement as both a national and an international one, what do you think of the idea that like the capital class is also, a global thing in that like it's not just Wall Street, but that there are like capitalists in like Dubai, in London, in Jakarta, New Delhi, Beijing, and how do you, knowing that or if you accept that, then how do you plan on like countering that global struggle inside of one locality?
Is that for Henry or for?
Or for everyone?
Okay, start with Henry.
I mean, I'd say I'm not opposed to forming a socialist party. I'm not opposed to that. I just think the conditions aren't right for it, right? Like, I do agree with what you were saying. We are not at the critical mass. DSA is not at the critical mass, from my understanding. Maybe that's changed, but yeah, I think just focus on pushing forward the struggle where you are. And I think gradually local struggles can kind of interconnect and develop from there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say capitalism is both a world system and a national system in all the different nations. And so that being the case, we need both a world revolution and we need a revolution in each country. It can't be just one or the other. And that's what I think one of the great values of Marxism historically was, that we recognized, as Fidel said, the duty of every revolutionary is to make revolution, both in their own country and then in solidarity with revolutions in every other country in the world. And so we need that balance, we need that dialectic. We need to be stressing both of those things, not prioritizing one over the other. Now, it may be very much easier to make revolution in country A than in country B. And so obviously we prioritize that way. But we always keep in mind our solidarity with the revolutionary movement in every other country and as a world movement.
Yeah, I think that they both put it exactly correctly. On one hand, the way that you engage with the revolutionary movement in your individual life is by identifying material crises in your immediate vicinity, for lack of a better term, and figuring out how you can build structures and communities and systems that help the people closest to you so that your efforts are the most effective in that immediate space. And then at all times, remembering that you are in solidarity with people who are doing the exact same thing around the world in their immediate vicinities and in their circumstances. Because ultimately this is we're gonna have to come together on this at some point, but if we're all waiting for somebody else to start doing it, it's never gonna happen.
Thank you. Next, Andy had his hand up, I believe.
I just want to point out that, Paul, as you said, the capitalist monster can continually reform itself, but there is a concrete fact, and it's before I became a communist. I just looked at worldwide GDP to national debt ratios at an all-time high, like eye-watering levels of debt. And in a country like America, consumer debt is also at an eye-watering high. And in history, whenever capitalism has run into a crisis, it either turns to fascism and or war to destroy productive means. And if we look at what's happening now with this idiotic assault on Iran, is an expression to me of the perhaps final crisis of capitalism, because it covers every inch of the world. It's got nowhere else to go. And as far as the time not being right, we've learned enough history that if people wait around until the time is right, they're too late. The point is, to me, and our party, is we want to get ahead. We don't want to wait until things are as miserable as they were in America in the 1930s in the Depression. Before that was the last big labor explosion, which in fact led Roosevelt to roll out Social Security, or else we're going to have an effing revolution, he was purported to say. And one of his aides said, "Mr. President, if this works, you'll be known as the greatest president ever." And he said, "If it doesn't work, I'll be the last president ever." So, but no one is alive from that era. But we want to learn from those eras and not allow the immiseration to get so pervasive before we rise up, before we have no shoes. Are we going to have to get back to that level of misery before it's the right time? I say no. We know enough history. In whatever way we want to approach it, we have to get ahead of events as much as possible. And that's a statement, not a question. Thank you.
All right, is there like a way you could rephrase that into a question, perhaps?
No.
No?
I
Okay.
just had something to say. Thank you guys, appreciate you.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Is it Tien? I want to call on somebody who
I
hasn't
do have
raised their hand
one
before.
question.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so this is for Bobby. Red Star. I'm curious about what Red Star is. It's within the DSA, and does it focus on like electoralism, like educating comrade, like you said you're a Marxist Leninist contingency within DSA. You focus on educating your group for electoral victories for the purpose of, building more members. And then what I ask is how does that translate into building worker power that can challenge the system of capitalism in the forms of general strikes and etc.
So what was the first half of that question?
How does Red Star focus on educating people within it?
Yeah, so Red Star is a caucus within DSA that views DSA as the best place to build the Workers' Party in embryo, essentially. And it requires that we take the vanguardist model and develop political education within DSA to members of DSA who are looking for a way to get involved with the political struggle, which is why they come and join DSA. So rather than simply plugging them into any given campaign that may come around or just putting all of our support behind Democrats or whoever, our goal is to recruit and train internally people who are organizing, whether that's in their immediate vicinity with mutual aid or whether they're doing their own educational things within their own spaces. We don't just stand within Red Star, we are all active within our local chapters, developing a cohesive political model that actually gets people on board with developing the movement from the perspective of DSA becoming down the line the place that this revolutionary workers' party comes out of, or at least that is when the crises arise and the spontaneous explosions of revolutionary opportunity come about, that DSA has the best position to then take that and direct that movement and that momentum towards real revolutionary change in America in coordination with revolutionary movements around the world, which is why Red Stars, one of our members who is the co-chair of DSA, was out in Europe and then was in Cuba and is going around the world, connecting with other movements that are trying to do the exact same thing. Because again, like DSA is not just in and of itself going to do all of this work on our own. What was the second half of that question?
Yeah, the second half of the question is how does that translate into? Well, I guess you said you're trying to reach people who are already in the workplace who can then.
So there's union organizing, there's popular education, there's activation through electoral campaigns. Like I do electoral campaigns because I have experience writing laws, advocating for laws, but I don't ask that everybody else go out and do electoral campaigns because they're not going to have the same unique experience and training and background as I am, whereas I might not have the same unique experience, training, and background as somebody who would be incredibly good at developing a popular education program, or the same background, experience, and training as somebody who would be able to develop a mutual aid system that feeds hundreds and hundreds of people every single day in their local space. What I can do is provide legal and political cover for people who are doing that important work, while also making it more difficult for the systems that are used to crack down on that work to be so aggressively reactionary.
Thank you. I want to take a few more questions. I just want to let everyone know that in 5 minutes we will be hitting the 2-hour mark. So we're just going to take a couple more questions, and I would like to remind the audience, we love Bobby and that he's here, but we have two really cool other panelists here. One of which is grandparents who are founding members of the Communist Party, so
No, it's great that, he's talking, so.
yeah. So, all right, Diego, you haven't been called on.
A lot of the stuff that I hear from like DSA or like even the caucuses in there, or RCA or PSL or whatever, is like rehashes of like the 1930s. And even like the stuff from like the 1970s, right, like was rehashed from that era, which was like the last time, like you said, the person that was here earlier, said it was like the last time that like the communist movement was actually big in the US or whatever. But like he said that too, like it failed, right? So like why, it seems like we can't like come up with new ideas. Like why do you guys think that is?
Just one quick point of clarification. RCA and PSL are not DSA caucuses.
I know that.
But, okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
All right, we'll start with Henry and move towards Bobby.
I think I wouldn't go so far to say that Sfadasu is a completely new thing, but I'd say it is trying to exit the cycles of the left failing, right? Because I mean, in terms of why it's difficult to create new ideas, I think people unconsciously create the problems of the past. Like they unconsciously repeat history. But I think if you try to, I guess, consciously repeat history and take, the new left seriously instead of dismissing it as like petty bourgeois students or whatever, then I think that can act as a starting point, and then you can move on to the more concrete details of that. But yeah, I think gaining just a good understanding of the new left, the old left, rather than just picking one particular thing, I guess.
Well, I would say there's a difference between failing and being defeated. So I don't know if these movements were necessarily failed so much as they were defeated because they were a threat to the system. But secondly, to me, the most important lesson about why they did not work was because people in this country were captivated by foreign models. The history of the Communist Party of the United States is the history to reproduce the Russian Revolution in the United States. Even though Gramsci in the 20s said revolution in the advanced capitalist countries is going to be in a completely different form than revolution in Russia. People didn't bother to figure out how we would do it specifically here based on our specific conditions. They copied a foreign model and imposed it on reality. Look at the New Left. The impact of the Cuban Revolution was enormous on the New Left. Where did the weather crazies get all their stuff from guerrilla warfare? Because again, they were looking to emulate a foreign model. And then the new communist movement, in which I was active, everybody was copying Chairman Mao and thinking we were gonna, the countryside was gonna surround the cities and all that kind of, just crazy stuff. Because it's so much easier to think that a foreign model has the key. Remember when the revolt in Chiapas happened? Everybody was, oh my God, this is the answer to all our problems. Subcomandante Marcos is going to teach us how to make revolution everywhere. It was, again, the cult of the foreign model has been our downfall. And so the lesson is, if we're going to make revolution in this country, we have to base it on American conditions and the unique features typical of American capitalism, and we have to create a correspondingly unique revolutionary path in order to do so. And if we don't undertake that work, we'll never get there.
I'll just broadly echo a lot of what Paul said there, but I would also say that I would add on to that and say I think we have some models of things that have worked within the American context that we can turn to, and I'm thinking specifically of the Black Panther Party and the movement towards their communist model that they had put forward. In that case, it really is a matter of a party being defeated, not a matter of it failing, being under attack from minute one, and then not having the ability to, over the long term, withstand that constant attack. And so it's important to acknowledge as we set up these structures that we will come under the same attack. And if we intend to do this revolutionary work, we are going to face reactionary violence. And if we want to continue to do this beyond the first salvo of that reactionary violence, we have to build systems and structures that can withstand it and develop our own redundancies and whatnot.
All right, we'll do two more questions because I saw two hands. Tian first. We'll do Tian first.
I want to go back to the environments and climates. As your earlier opening statement, you framed it in regards to capitalism in Arizona. You mentioned how even though with many minefields being open up around the Tucson cities, it didn't necessarily improve the living conditions of the local people, and it reminds me immediately of one of the quote from Joe Mazzini, Stage of Capitalism. It mentions basically saying that capitalism has socialized the production, yet while kept the appropriation private.
Mm-hmm.
But with that in mind, when you're turning your eyes towards, say, the other alternative systems, say the Soviet Unions, it also had drained the Aral seas that situated between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and the Maoist China also have intensified the desertization of the Taklamakan Desert, even though in recent years there have been putting more effort in the de-desertization of that process. So to me, I'm just curious, what do you all envision could be the possible solution in the problem with managing of resources and protecting climate in this supposed alternative system that's beyond capitalism? Since the attempts from others, political government seem to also struggle with that issue. And also, I should mention, I guess, in those scenarios, in the Soviet Union, in China, this appropriation of resources didn't necessarily bring the immediate benefits to the local population either. It was very much then relocated to the other more economically prominent area.
So is the question like, how could socialism,
How could the alternative system handle the questions of alternative system to capitalism, handle the issues of environment, resources better?
okay, and that's for everybody?
Definitely target slightly more to
Right.
how.
No, I mean, I think there's no question that one of the major reasons that socialism failed in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China was the fact that they completely failed to recognize finite resources in a finite planet and respond accordingly. There was a cult of economic development that dominated these countries. I mean, Marx said the motto of communism was going to be from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Well, if you had a system where everybody's need could be met, you would need an abundance of material resources. The whole struggle of building socialism in these countries was to achieve that level of resources, and in the course of which they disregarded fundamental laws regarding nature, energy production, the environment, etc. And so obviously, any socialism that's going to succeed in the future is going to have to recognize those problems and apply a correct alternative approach. I'm not a scientist. I'm not here to be able to tell you, oh, energy form A or energy form B is going to be the answer. But clearly, recognizing the mistakes that were made and building into the system ways to prevent their reoccurrence is the key to any successful socialist future.
What is that? All right, fantastic. We'll go with Eric.
I just have a clarification question.
Oh, all right, yeah, clarification.
So basically what you're saying is that the reason for failure is due to a lack of ability for the people involved in those systems to understand basic hardline restraints such as biology, resource management, and other such items?
Am I saying that that was the reason those systems failed?
Yeah.
No, I'm saying that was one of the reasons those systems failed. There were lots of other reasons too.
All right. Kirk?
Since colonialism was mentioned earlier, I believe, and the question of like global reparations came up, should the living be responsible in adjudicating the sins of the dead? Does the political overcoming of capitalism demand such retributive justice? Is not the utopian promise of modernity, bourgeois society, what the socialists have and always were aiming to realize in the 19th century onwards, when the bourgeois were no longer able to lead? The freedom from history, life on the basis of your own choosing, your labor, and not from those chains in which we inherit. Or, as the founding fathers put it, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Is that a question?
Yeah.
I guess I can start. I don't think it's the most effective thing to organize around reparations for colonialism. Right? I mean, some people would argue that the working class in the imperial core has benefited from the exploitation of the working class outside. But if you want to have a revolution and the first demand is make the conditions of the working class in the imperial core worse, then they're not going to participate. And they're the main people who have to participate. if we are to overcome this system. So I just think it's politically ineffective.
Yeah, no, I was talking about it as a principle. I wasn't talking about it as an organizing strategy. I'm not saying go to American workers and say, give up everything so that we can, pay reparations to Haiti or to the Dominican Republic or whatever else. But ultimately, I think, if the world system is to be made whole and healthy, that's something that has to be discussed by a socialist world community.
Yeah, it's a matter of establishing true equity and equality following the overthrow of a capitalist system. And one of the main principles and pillars of future socialist or communist systems should be that the wealth distribution being equal across the board so that there is not the inequality which causes further exploitation and further opportunities for alienation and exploitation and abuses of the powerful over the less powerful.
Fantastic. Well, we just passed the 2-hour mark here. I think we're gonna call it. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Give it a after this, we plan on going to Casey Moore's to continue the conversation, have some drinks, and talk about capitalism. It will likely take us a cool 30-35 minutes to get this room back in order, to be polite to the people that let us rent it. But yeah, we plan on going there. If you want to meet us there, feel free. And I just would like to say that we have free literature from the Platypus Affiliated Society on that table. Our comrades in the Revolutionary Communists of America are outside tabling as well. They have literature too. And I believe, though didn't get confirmation, that Henry's organization, Sfadasu, has a table set up as well. So thank you for coming out. And yeah.
We can all talk out there.